Good morning and welcome to the seventh session of our psychology unit. And we're continuing to be here to learn, to have fun, and to make a difference. For those of you who submitted Teach to Learn notes yesterday, I forwarded them to Mary, and she's made comments on them, and we'll be sending them back to you shortly. Be sure to touch base personally with the people you're inviting to your capstone presentations. Your list of red beads should be added to until Thursday, and then please submit the list along with the other assignments for that day. Today's key concepts are included in our better feedback checklist. We will review the distinctions of necessary versus sufficient and introduce some of the unintended consequences of feedback processes, and also discuss why our feedback processes should not be considered a system of measurement. If you've not shared your plan for this week's PDSA, please do so. And those of you who have done so, please let me know if you have any questions about the comments you've received. So our first concept to discuss this morning is a review of the distinctions necessary versus sufficient. These distinctions were included in Unit 4 with our list of measurement cautions. A necessary condition is one in whose absence a result is not possible, meaning we got to have it. A sufficient condition is one in whose presence this result is certain. That means it's a done deal. Question we can ask ourselves is, can we always assume that the person we are evaluating generated on their own the results we are discussing? Or are we ignoring other necessary conditions? Are the employee's actions sufficient to produce the results they're being held accountable for? Let's review two examples of these conditions. An acorn is necessary for an oak, and an acorn is clearly not sufficient for an oak. Other environmental factors must be in place for the oak to grow. The right combinations of soil, moisture, sunlight, and certain nutrients are all necessary to produce an oak tree. Rain is sufficient for wet sidewalks. And we also know rain is not necessary for wet sidewalks. Sprinkler systems, for example, not just rain, can cause wet sidewalks. We will want to be aware that the results we observe could be caused by other factors than the ones we are currently focusing our attention upon. This feedback factor is closely related to the performance equation x plus yx equals 8. In this case, are we asking, is the person receiving feedback necessary for the observed results to occur? And are you asking, is the person receiving feedback sufficient for the observed results? So when we look at the scale that we have here, I'm going to put a pointer on. We have this scale here of sufficiency. On this side of the scale, the employee is completely sufficient to produce the outcome we're looking at. And on the other side of the scale, the employee is insufficient to produce the results. And then the vertical says the employee is necessary to produce the outcome. And in the bottom of this vertical, the employee's input is unnecessary to produce the outcomes. So we have different results. And in most of our situations, we should be over here. And when we score our feedback process, we should be scoring the assumption the feedback process makes about people and their performance. Ideally, we should say the employee input plus other inputs are required for the outcomes we're observing. If the process believes the employees produce the outcomes alone without interactions from others of the system, we are up in this category. And then otherwise, the employee is not necessary. We have other scores for that. So when we look at what do we do in those situations, in this case, we improve the system and optimize interactions to produce better performance. If we think only the individual is responsible, then we should spend all our time developing individuals. And our organization should have dominant employee development programs because that's the focus. We think employees are responsible. So we should be training and developing individuals in a very massive manner. Otherwise, we have other places where we improve the system because we don't believe the employee is connected to the results, or we decide there's some economic exchange that we can use to improve the system, meaning we can outsource, we can combine things differently, those sorts of things. Our next factor is avoiding unintended consequences. We're going to look at the unintended consequences of most feedback. Along with each unintended consequence, I'll provide a suggestion for addressing or eliminating that unintended consequence. The first unintended consequence of most feedback processes is that available feedback is ignored. The improved method around that we could approach is using multiple sources of feedback and not only the manager. Others are held responsible for the presence of feedback is one of the unintended consequences of most feedback processes. The improved method is the employee is responsible for the presence of feedback. Another unintended consequence is the manager becomes the customer of the employee's work and performance. An improved method is the focus is on customers, internal and external. And relationships potentially become damaged as a consequence of our current processes. In improved methods, relationships are cooperative. And finally, sub-optimization begins to occur. And improvement would focus on contributions to organization level objectives and outcomes rather than individual ones. So we want to look at a rating of how we're doing on all those possible unintended consequences. Are they occurring or are they not occurring when we score this? And then finally, we look at, do we have a system of measurement or are we out of control? So output from feedback processes is often used as if it were a measurement. We have some version of a ordinal number that comes out of our feedback processes. And yet what we know is different feedback providers or evaluators produce different evaluations. Deming said this, the closest approach possible to a numerical evaluation of any characteristics of a process is a result that emanates from a system of measurement that shows evidence that it is in statistical control. So we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we have a system? How do we know a system is in statistical control? So feedback processes are usually not a useful system of measurement due to these factors. They contain special causes. They're unpredictable from person to person. Observations by a single rater fail to show statistical control. These two factors show up in Daniel Kahneman's latest book, Noise. So if you want to get some more insight into some of these issues and how to address them, that's a very good source. Results obtained by different raters cannot be compared. And there's no running record for judging whether or not the state of statistical control exists. Now, Ashley recorded this comment in her Teach to Learn notes following the red bead experiment. And this is what she recorded. She pointed out that one of our evaluations is based off a manager's opinion of your performances, but also noted that all managers are not equal in performance evaluations. which can cause this system to be flawed. This is a perfect example of what we're talking about here. So when evaluating your feedback process, ask yourself if you have data that make it possible to determine whether or not these descriptions fit your process. If you do not have such data, then your feedback process is not a system of measurement, and the outputs from it should be treated as personal opinions and not measures. So the green side is, yes, it's a system that's in statistical control. The red side is, no, it's not. So do we contain special causes, or are there no special causes? We have to remember back to Unit 4, Understanding Variation. How do we determine whether or not there's a special cause in our process? The only way to do that is with a control chart. Is our process predictable from person to person? Do our observations show statistical control? Are the results obtained by different people in statistical control? And is there a running record for judging whether or not the state of statistical control exists? Now, whatever most feedback processes are, they do not represent a useful system of measurement. I'm not going to read all this, but basically what we're having is a description from Dr. Deming's book that says, here's what's required to have a measurement system that's in statistical control. So when we apply those concepts to our feedback processes, we want to ask ourselves, do we have a system of measurement, or are we basically out of control? From the distinction that we learned in Unit 4, out of control means not stable and a process that has special causes. So now we've covered all of the checklist concepts from our checklist for a feedback process. Before we get into our exercise, any comments, questions, or thoughts that you want to share? Okay. So in our next exercise, you'll begin to design a feedback process that you believe is transformational and not simply a good adjustment to the existing process. And nearly everyone attempting this finds themselves constrained in their thinking by the limitations currently imposed by their organization. And not to worry, you're not being asked to implement a transform process, but only stretch yourself and your thinking to design an improved approach. So you've recorded your current process on the left side of your document, and you've labeled it before. And you will use your summary of your current process during your partner exercise. So first thing we're going to do is identify fundamental elements of feedback. So we're breaking it down in the simplest, most basic forms that we can think of when we discuss what's part of our feedback process. So just like these shapes are fundamental elements to creating any drawing, please identify or declare which elements are fundamental to a feedback process. And included in sources of ideas for creating lists of fundamental elements of feedback are your feedback checklist, which has 11 items in it, and elements described in your pre-work illustration. Remember, some of the key elements that are more or less tangible, some key elements are more or less tangible than others, such as timing between action, result, and then feedback about the result. The strength of the interactions or relationships between the people participating in the feedback conversations is another factor that could be considered an element in the feedback process. So for our activity here, we'll do with a partner. Select 3 key elements. identify 5 to 7 approaches to each of those 3 key elements. And continue work, submit these things today. So this is something you won't complete necessarily during the rest of the class session, but you might. So here's an example of a key element, and I'm just going to label this timing. And here's 7 approaches to saying, here's different approaches to addressing the key element timing in a feedback process. So feedback timing could be based on each moon's orbit, or in other words, once a month, basically, every 4 weeks. We could base it on every Earth orbit annually. So every time we go around the sun, we do a feedback session. We could provide feedback at the end of each project that a person is working on. Feedback timing could be performed weekly, or it could be based upon every PDSA study step, and we have feedback conversations that way. Or we might say, let's do feedback conversations daily. Or we could say, and this is a possibility, never. Or as this gentleman is saying, no, Thursday's out. How about never? Is never good for you? So there's lots of elements that we have available to us to discuss and develop different approaches to applying in our ideal feedback process. So again, you've recorded your current process on the left side of your document, and you've labeled it before, and you use your summary of a current process and to begin to draft ideal approaches to potentially ideal process. So first of all, we're breaking it down into the different elements before we put it back together and say, this is probably an ideal approach to doing this. So questions about our assignment? All right, so I'm going to create the breakout rooms. So we're going to have breakout rooms with Ian and Rocky, Gloria and Tyler, and Ashley and Eric. So is the assignment clear? You're going to come up with 3 elements. Let's go back to that slide. Select 3 key elements and then identify 5 to 7 approaches to each of those 3 elements. Okay. So this is just to get you thinking of, there's lots of different ways to approach how we do feedback. And one of the ways to begin to develop those different approaches is to take the elements that we have in our current feedback process and say, here's other ways to do this than how we're currently doing it. All right. All right, so we're going to have about 20 minutes for this to work on, and then we'll get back together and talk about how much progress we've been able to make. Okay. All right, so I've opened the rooms and we'll start our 20 minutes. Excellent. So let's share. So Ian and Rocky, what were the elements that you selected?
So they were participants, yeah, documents and locations.
I got it. Okay. And then Gloria and Tyler, what were the 3 that you selected?
We did frequency, documents, and managers' words and thoughts.
Excellent. And then Ashley and Eric.
We had timing, accomplishments, and goal.
Okay, good. So as you work through these things, what are some of the things you noticed about the feedback process itself and possible design or redesign of it?
I feel like the redesign, at least the ideas that Tyler and I was thinking of, some of it is definitely so possible to implement. And I feel like it just shows that there's like, kind of from that TED talk, like functional fixedness of performance evaluations. Overall, like maybe in companies, like maybe when people set up companies, they're like, oh, this is how people do performance reviews. So now it's like standard throughout like most companies. But some of the things that we came up with, I feel like aren't like super like big changes that don't even exist now. It's just like it could be formalized. So I see like the potential to maybe make change in those areas.
That's great. Yeah. And one of the things that we want to remember is we're not designing a process that our organization should implement. We're designing what we think could be an ideal process. So Eric and Ashley, what were some of the alternatives you came up with for your key elements?
Well, the biggest theme is that I think we felt they're too individualized and they're too quantifiable right now. And so the more that we can foster cross collaboration and set goals as teams and departments and influences of change, the better it's going to be, not just for an individual, but for a team and a line of business as well. So some of those approaches are, instead of accomplishing individual goals, looking at PDSA cycles and progresses, the impact of that those may have on customers and internal and external, and then influencing change and development too. How do you quantify, somebody being able to develop in a way that it looks like it's an accomplishment, instead of somebody who just goes and does a daily item and gets more reward for that than they do for a person who's came a long way in terms of growing and evolving within the company.
Yeah, those are excellent issues to be concerned about and to want to address. Ian and Rocky, what were some of the alternatives that you came up with?
So one of them that we talked about was who involved as a skip level review to possibly go one level above your manager and meet with them, not on a regular basis, but a somewhat frequently occurring, just to get a different perspective on who you're talking to. Mm-hmm. And that way you're not limiting yourself to one perspective.
Excellent. This is good work. So as we draft our ideal process, you can begin to use your partner session outputs. And of course, there'll be more than the 3 elements that you want to evaluate and for which to consider alternative approaches. The final version of your ideal feedback process is going to be turned in on Thursday. So again, please don't constrain yourself by designing your ideal process to be one you believe your organization will allow you to implement. Use what you've learned about all the areas of the system or profound knowledge to design a win-win process that supports joint work while making system improvements possible. So your ideal feedback process, you might want to start sketching it, but certainly even what you turn in is not a final piece of art. It's only a draft, and we'll continue looking at that. If you sketched anything today, please submit that. If not, that's all right. This exercise itself could be an element of your teach to learn conversation today. And then please continue your red bead list. That will be turned in Thursday. So the final elements that we discussed in transforming our feedback is necessary versus sufficient, unintended consequences, and not a system of measurement. And please continue making progress on your PDSA cycles. Our quotes for today, one comes from Clayton Christensen, Competing Against Luck, the Story of Innovation and Customer Choice. Theory may conjure up images of ivory tower musings, but I assure you that it is the most practical and useful business tool we can offer you. Good theory helps us understand how and why. It helps us make sense of how the world works and predict the consequences of our decisions and our actions. And then from a Nobel Prize winner, Wolfgang Ernst Pauli, he says, "I do not mind if you think slowly, but I do object when you publish more quickly than you think." That's good. Well, thank you very much for your participation and contributions today. I'm looking forward to seeing the work that you're producing on your ideal feedback process, as well as your teach to learn conversations.
Sorry, I have
So-
a quick question.
Yeah, please.
So from like the homework list, the ideal like draft that you mentioned, and then the 3 elements, 5 to 7 approach is like the same assignment, right? You're just saying that we could submit a draft today if we wanted to, even though the official is due on Thursday.
Right. If you've got
Okay.
something you want to send in and get comments on, that's fine. Otherwise, it's the final isn't due till Thursday. So, yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So anything else? Because we've got what you've selected in your partner group on our video, you don't need to send in a separate document. However, I guess I need to modify that. I would like to see the 7 alternatives for each of the elements that you've selected. So if you could, one of you from each pair could send that in. So for instance, Ian and Rocky, which one of you will send in your list?
I can do it.
Okay, thanks, Ian. And Gloria and Tyler? Thanks, Tyler. And then Ashley and Eric. Eric will. Okay, good. All right, thanks for that. Anything else before I say goodbye for the day? Okay, hope everybody has a great day. Please take care, and we will see you later. Bye now.